Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Monday Morning Musing. This is Steve Crosby. We are continuing on in this series about Roman meal practices as it relates to what Jesus did at the Eucharist. All right. After the Deipnon, the main meal was over, there was a significant pivot point. And even in Scripture, it says, after supper, he took the cup. There was a pivot point at a Roman banquet where libations and offerings to the gods and to Caesar were offered. These were mandatory. The rest of the symposium, which we're going to get to in another episode, could not happen without it. The meal could not go forward without the offering of libations. Now, normally, the most common one was offerings to Dionysus, the god of wine and party and etc. But after Augustus's victory in Egypt, it became mandatory that at any banquet in the Roman Empire, by anybody, anywhere, it was mandatory that libation offerings, libation worship, the cup, had to be raised in the honor of Caesar, in the honor of Augustus, and that continued on after Augustus was gone. So in the middle of the meal, the host or the symposiarch was responsible to start this process of honoring the gods and honoring Caesar. And in typical Mid-Eastern fashion, this could go on and on and on and on. Because if you had a spy from Rome, or one of Caesar's spies was there, you want a good report. Oh, so-and-so spoke so eloquently of you, versus, so-and-so was kind of was a little short. So this part of the meal, and particularly if you've been drinking a little bit, could get, I don't know what the word would be, just flattery to the point of absurdity. But the main thing, the main tie-in to what Jesus did, it's the first thing you have to do after supper. It's time for the honoring of the deity. And in this case, Caesar. So what the host would do, they would have a main bowl of the 3-to-1 watered down wine, and he would take a single cup of that wine. He'd pronounce the name of the deity over it, and say all kinds of great things about the deity, with this cup. He would spill a little bit on the floor, and I don't know what that meant. Somebody knows more than I do, may know what that means, but he'd spill a little bit on the floor. It's like a symbolic offering. And then he would pass it, he would take a sip, and then pass it to the right. Remember, to the right would be the place of honor. And after everybody at the table had taken a sip from the cup, then they would sing a hymn, they would chant, they would do a victory song about the deity. It would somewhat depend on the reason for the banquet, what they did. But those features, the singing, the chanting, the reciting of poetry, the exhortations, all would happen after the libation. And for us, it ties in perfectly to 1 Corinthians 11. Now, if you go to a typical Pentecostal or charismatic church, you're going to hear about 1 Corinthians chapters 12 to 14, on and 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 on. Without 1 Corinthians 11, which is dealing with the meal, there is no chapter 12, 13, and 14. Chapters 12, 13, and 14 are in the context of chapter 11. If you don't get these things right from chapter 11, you're not going to understand correctly 12, 13, and 14. Because you're going to see, from what I just said, that 12, 13, and 14, the singing of hymns, the exercise of gifts, the caring for one another, the exhortations, words, speeches, tongues, happened, listen carefully, at the meal. Listen carefully, not during the song service. Again, this is for people who think we want a New Testament church. We want to do it like they did in the New Testament. We want a New Testament church. How much evidence is there in the New Testament for a 40-minute worship song led by a worship team? Zero. And that's why I can't respect or take seriously the folks that write these books about, we want to do organic church and we want to do home church and we want to do it like the way they did it in the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, the meal was the center of the meeting. The meal is where everything happened during the second half of the meal, during the symposium, when the talking would occur. And then that also makes a little bit of cultural sense where Paul's thing about women be quiet. Because it was the symposium, it wasn't the church service. It was a symposium part of the meal. They were supposed to be quiet, and they're not supposed to be shouting from the back benches to their husbands who are orating. It would be disruptive to the meal. Ask them at home. It's got nothing to do whether or not women should preach in the church. It's just that is a gross acultural mishandling of the scripture. It's got nothing to do with a ban on females speaking. It's about interrupting the symposium. And that's why then Paul says, well, let everything be done neatly and decently in order. What order? The order that I'm sharing with you in these past few weeks. The order, the processes of a Roman banquet. Follow those patterns. They were people of their time. To think that because they gave their hearts to Lord, they somehow transcended and floated above the cultural norms of their day. That's just romantic mythology. They weren't freaks in that way. We're going to talk about the things that were taught that got them in trouble with Caesar. But in the sense of how they did their stuff, they were normal. Look, as Christians in our day, we sit at tables and we eat. And we drink and we laugh and we thank the host. And then we go maybe sit in a living room. We have more conversation. And it's very casual and informal. It just wasn't that way. There were things that had to happen. And the libation was the pivot. It was the signal to everybody. First of all, that we are following, obeying Caesar's command. We are good little citizens, and nobody's going to come and haul us off to jail or kill us. And then that the second part of the meeting is about to begin. It's time for the women to leave. It's time for the slaves to clean up and get out of here. And it's time for the musicians, and that would have been normally female flute players, to come in. If there's any actors or poetry, it's time for all that stuff after the meal. So, deipnon, the supper, libation, the pivot point, and then we're going to get to symposium a little bit. We've already talked about a little bit today. I'll see you next time.